Hi everyone, if you want to learn how to play the Ruy Lopez, then the name of former world champion Anatoly Karpov would immediately come to mind. In today's game, we'll see how he masterfully exploits a space advantage and how he plays against an ugly knight on b7. So let's get started with the game. This is a game that can teach us how to play positional chess regardless of the opening. After e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6 and bishop to b5, we get the Ruy Lopez. Here black continue with the move a6, which is one of the most common replies. And after bishop to a4, knight to f6, here castling is a very common move. And here black played bishop to e7, which is a very common move. Taking on e4 is an option, b5 as well, planning to develop the bishop on f8 to c5. But bishop to e7 is a popular and solid option. And after rook to e1, b5, bishop to b3, d6, c3. This is a very common idea in the Ruy Lopez, planning to go d4. Here black castled, and before going for d4 ideas, here Karpov played the move h3, which prevents some bishop to g4 ideas that would pin the knight, which is a very important piece that has control over d4 square. And in this position black has a few options. Black went for knight to a5, which is a very common move. Just want to briefly mention another interesting idea, which is going knight to b8. Even though this seems like a paradoxical move going back, the idea is to bring a bishop to b7 and not having the knight on c6 blocking the bishop, and the knight can come back to d7. So this knight is going to be a critical piece in the game because, spoiler alert, it's going to be quite a passive piece for black. But here the move knight to a5 makes some sense. On one hand, black is moving a knight to the edge of the board, which is normally not a good idea, but the idea is to capture this very strong bishop on b3, which Karpov moved to c2, and now the follow-up is c5. The knight on c6 was blocking the c-pawn, so now the pawn on c5 is controlling this very important d4 square. So after d4, queen to c7, knight b to d2, here black played the move knight to c6, which we can consider a slight inaccuracy. So before going knight to c6, taking on d4 is an interesting alternative, which is nowadays a very common move, and only now go knight to c6, putting pressure on the center, and the main idea is that after d5, now the knight has the additional b4 square, which is a square that the knight wouldn't have with a pawn on c3. So now here black is putting pressure against the bishop, and after the bishop moves, now black has the move a5 with the idea to have a retreat square. So after a move like a3 and knight to a6, this knight has the c5 square available and is going to be a much better knight than in the game. Because after knight to c6, here Karpov played the very strong d5, and now the knight doesn't really have a good square to go. Knight to b8 doesn't make sense, just going back. In the game black went knight to d8, the knight could go back to a5, but here after a move like b3, this knight really doesn't have any future there. So black tried knight to d8, planning to activate the knight via b7. And here Karpov went a4, this is a typical idea in the Ruy Lopez, planning to activate this rook on a1, which is white's most passive piece. There's an idea to take on b5 because the a6 pawn would be pinned, so black went rook to b8, and after pawn takes and pawn takes, now white got the open a file. And here Karpov played one of the deepest moves in the game, which is the move b4. Because black may have ideas to activate the knight via c5, for example after a move like knight to f1, c4 and then bring the knight all the way to c5. So this knight on d8 is just extremely passive, so black has to do something about it. If black manages to bring a knight to c5, black will be doing more than fine. So Karpov anticipated this idea and he played this very deep move b4. So the pawn on b4 is controlling the c5 square, and even though this seems like a weakening move because the c4 square is now weakened, black doesn't have any way to bring a knight to that square. So a weak square that cannot be exploited is not really weak, so b4 is a great move. So here black went knight to b7, Karpov definitely doesn't want to take on c5 and allow a knight to come to c5. He's going to leave that pawn on b4, and this knight on b7 is actually not doing anything there. So now Karpov went knight to f1, a very common idea to bring a knight to g3 and get some play on the king side. And after bishop to d7, bishop to e3, black went rook to a8, queen to d2, rook f to c8, planning to put some pressure against the bishop on c2 after taking on b4, so Karpov went bishop to d3, here black went g6, anticipating some knight to f5 ideas after Karpov went knight to g3, bishop to f8, bishop to g7 is another idea behind the move g6, now Karpov went rook to a2, planning to double rooks on the a file, Here black went c4, and now Karpov went bishop to b1. And here black went queen to d8, which has a very strong positional refutation. Here black should have tried something like knight to d8, planning to go queen to b7 and then trade rooks. So white has a space advantage, so trading pieces is something that black would like to do to relieve the pressure. And queen to d8 seems to be a similar idea. So now black wants to take on a2 and then bring a rook to the a file. But here comes a very deep refutation, which is the move bishop to a7. Preventing this idea and now leaving this knight on b7, which literally doesn't have any squares to go. So now white can slowly double on the a file and then focus on improving on the king side. So here black tried a knight to e8, and after bishop to c2, knight to c7, white doubled on the a file, and after queen to e7. So white has a clear advantage, but now we'll see Karpov at his best, slowly but surely improving his position and not giving any chances to his opponent. So this is something that is very hard to do, to outplay your opponent when you have to slowly maneuver. And if you want to learn how to do this and how to get better at chess overall, I have a free course that will help you with that. So feel free to check the link in the description. So let's continue with the rest of the game. Here Karpov went bishop to b1. Karpov has no hurry. Sooner or later bishop to b6 might be an idea, but Karpov will want to do that only when it leads to a decisive advantage. So here black went bishop to e8, which is quite passive. I think that black had to activate this knight on b7 by going f6 and then bring the knight all the way to f7, because this is really black's worst piece. And after bishop to e8, knight to e2, knight to d8 and knight to h2. This is also a typical idea in the Ruy Lopez. f4 now becomes available, and there's also some ideas to go knight to g4. Black went bishop to g7, and after f4, black played passively as he did pretty much in the whole game. Black went f6. If black takes on f4, here white has a few options. One of them is to go queen takes f4, and even though black gets the e5 square for a knight, which for the time being is not easily available for a knight, now white also gets the d4 square for a knight himself. So that was an alternative. White was doing better there, but also after f6, white went f5, gaining more space on the king side. Here black decided to go g5, which as we'll see didn't go very well. Knight to f7 was probably an interesting alternative to keep some tension, even though white is clearly better here. Also taking on f5 was not that good, because after white takes on f5, now the e4 square might become available for a knight, so white has a clear position advantage here. And after g5, now the h5 square has become weakened, and we see how Karpov slowly but surely exploits that. Bishop to c2, planning to bring a bishop all the way to h5. Bishop to f7, knight to g3, knight to b7. This knight is really doing nothing there, so it's absolutely misplaced. Bishop to d1, h6. Karpov went bishop to h5. The idea is to trade bishops and then bring a knight or a queen to h5. And after queen to e8 and queen to d1, black went knight to d8. Sooner or later we're gonna get a trade on h5. Karpov again doesn't rush, he improves his pieces a tiny little bit, rook a3, and then he goes for rook 1 to a2, just bringing them one square forward before going for the final blow. Here black is simply waiting, king to g8, knight to g4, black went king to f8, taking on h5, doesn't win a piece, because after queen takes, and knight takes f6, white gives a check and wins the queen. And after king to f8, knight to e3, king to g8, bishop takes, knight takes. Now Karpov brings a queen to h5. The game is pretty much over because white has much better knights and also a much better bishop. Black's bishop on g7 is just a big pawn doing nothing at all. And after knight to d8, queen to g6 is a very nice move. If black ever trades on g6, then white will bring a knight to f5, attacking black's pieces. So this is positionally losing for black. And after king to f8, knight to h5, here black decided to resign. White is attacking on g7, besides trading queens, which is great for white. Black could have tried something like queen to e7, defending the bishop on g7, but here white has a few options. One of them is knight to g4, putting more pressure on black's position, so black's position is just collapsing here. Or even a very nice way to finish this positional masterpiece was to now go bishop to e6, open the a file, because black's pieces are now overloaded. For example, after black trades on a3, rook to a8 here is not possible because now white can simply trade, and after bishop takes, black cannot take the bishop on the 8 without losing the bishop on g7. So hope that you enjoyed this very deep game that will teach you a lot of ideas about how to play the Ruy Lopez, but also how to play positional chess like a world champion. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.